I'm Tanya Fox, and you're listening to Fox Talks Business Podcast. I started my career in the corporate world, but always played to my own tune and loved to think outside of the box. This didn't always serve me well with the bosses, so I made the decision to become an entrepreneur. And that little seed of entrepreneurial curiosity continued to grow as I branched out into retail, service, and franchise businesses. Now, I have been fortunate to have amazing successes in the last 2 decades, but they did not come without some really big failures and even bigger lessons learned. And that's why I started this podcast, not just to share the failures, but to show you how you can turn every failure into a success. We're going to hear from some amazing humans from around the world that are going to share their stories of the good, the bad, and the motivational entrepreneurial life has to offer. After all, life is too short to make all of the mistakes yourself, so why not learn from each other? And of course, we're going to have some fun, because as I always say, well, you know what? I'll tell you that at the end of the episode. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Emily. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, I love to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk a lot about delegation, but first let's get a little bit of history of your background on how you got into this.
Yeah, I say that my history with delegation is really like 360 because the early part of my career, I was working as an executive assistant. I was working at UPenn and I was working, in companies and things like that. And, I was really good at it. I really enjoyed helping others. And when I had my son, I said, I like the work, but I don't like the commute and the whole like structure. And I learned that, hey, there's actually an industry out there where you can do this remotely from home. So I started my company, Delegate Solutions, in 2007 when my son was born. And in the early days, I was the assistant doing a lot of the work. We still do have some clients from when I was the assistant, and it ran that way for a few years. And then I really became very entrepreneurial with it and sort of recognized that there was an opportunity, not only in the industry I was in, but an opportunity to do this work differently, and really hone in on supporting only entrepreneurs and what they need. And we sort of built out a delegation company around that. So now I delegate to others, whereas before I was the one being delegated to. So it's definitely been a 360 journey with delegation for myself.
So this, I really want to dive into this because I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs that go, come up with all of the excuses of why they can't delegate at this time, but don't really understand why it's so hard for them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was sharing earlier that I turned my book in. It's called A Culture of Delegation. And so much of that book, the first third of it is all about the mindset that has to be present for delegation to work well. And in my work writing that book, I really realized there's so many reasons that we don't delegate that have literally nothing to do with the technique of delegation or who we're delegating to or any of that. It really comes down to us. And I think one of the main reasons entrepreneurs in specific really have a hard time with this is because there's a fear there of, well, what am I going to do instead? And that might be a very subtle fear. That might be a fear that you haven't even recognized in yourself. But for us, the top thing that needs to be present for delegation to work well is for you to have a really clear picture of who you are and what your contribution is going to be and why that's valuable and important. So it sort of like shifts the conversation away from, like you having to figure out what to delegate, how to delegate, all of that. Why aren't you delegating? And is it because you're sort of anxious about what you're going to do with this time instead?
Well, and I think that, that's a good way to look at it because I think a lot of times we come up with it, with other reasons that are outside, like it'd take me too long to train somebody to be able to, do this, or they're not going to be able to do it like I would do it. I need somebody who would do it, who would produce the product exactly how I would produce it, as opposed to going, why am I hanging on to this?
And I'm not saying it's always the case, but I'm saying that in our work with entrepreneurs, and I teach an e-course on this topic, the very first session of that course is, what are you here to do? Like, what is your contribution supposed to be? And can you lovingly accept that? Because a lot of the times it's not tied to any level of productivity. It's tied towards impact. It's tied towards vision. And so that can feel really uncomfortable, especially if you're used to living in this, like, I'm so busy, and that's become such a persona for you that everybody's like, oh my God, well, she's so busy. Well, what are you busy doing? And is it really making a difference through your work? So.
Yeah. And I love that point, because I think that we really are, I'm hoping that we're getting out of it. But I know even for myself, I got stuck in that culture of equating busyness to successfulness, and then realizing I don't want to be successful that way. I want to have lots of time and, have a lot of stuff just sort of happening, but not me having to do it.
Right. And there's a level of complexity there that we didn't even touch on yet that's tied to that point, which is entrepreneurs, can get addicted to being the hero, right? Saving the day. Everybody's counting on you to come in and figure out this problem or fix this issue. And that's addicting, like this feeling of adrenaline that comes from that, this feeling of being the one who puts out all the fires. Like, it becomes a badge of honor for us. And so it can be really hard to recognize that pattern and understand and break through it to the next level of like, but what I'm really here to contribute is the vision for what we're trying to do. And sometimes that means I'm outside with my chickens, which is what I'm doing. I'll be outside with my chickens, just kind of watching them and thinking, and that's the value that I'm bringing to the table. So it's a big change, big shift.
Yeah. But I think it definitely is an important one to, not only give yourself that space, but allow the space for other people that, you're building this team up to shine and to be the hero too.
Yeah.
That's quite powerful for me to think of it that way. Let's talk a little bit about bottleneck behaviors. So can you describe to us kind of what that is?
Yeah. So bottleneck behavior is when we find our team's getting stuck and held back from being able to accomplish things because of us. And so in our work with entrepreneurs, we've identified 5 different types of what we call bottleneck behaviors that we all sort of exhibit and vacillate through across the day. And it's interesting because there's one that I specifically align to, but there's also, multiple other types too. So would it be helpful to kind of run through what those are?
Yeah, I would love that.
Okay. So the first one we kind of talked a little bit about, it's called the hero. Entrepreneurs are notorious for this. And again, we get a lot of energy by feeling needed and solving problems. And we're really good at it. Typically, that's why we've become so successful. And really what has happened is there's just this lack of autonomy in your team because they're conditioned to kind of include you because you're sort of a key cog in the wheel of whatever that process is. So that's usually present in every entrepreneur at most days.
Yeah. And I think that, that's a big one because we feel like we need to, right? Like we need to see everything that goes out to make sure, it's on point. We almost get that, I call it the chef mentality, where they're like, no dish leaves the kitchen unless I've tasted it.
Yeah. And, I've been in my business. So my business is 15 years old now, like my son. That's how I remember. But he literally likes to take credit. He's like, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have started the business. I was like, oh, kind of true. But, like I found myself kind of really struggling with letting go of different parts of the business. And I think I was I was behaving with some hero tendencies. And I think ultimately for me, what I uncovered is that there were parts of the business that weren't working right that I need to fix before I can really step out. So it doesn't mean because you're hanging on to things that like, oh, you need to just let go. Like, I think trust your instincts there, but just be aware that these bottlenecks exist and that, if you're doing something more than once, for example, it's a candidate for delegation, 100%. So always start with those types of repeatables as things that you can get out of.
Yeah. All right. So hero is the first one. What is the other ones?
Yeah, so the interventionist is the second one. That's your typical micromanager. So it's kind of like the chef you were talking about. Like, I need to taste every single dish and wipe the corners of every single dish. But what happens is, we hit a ceiling with our time, and so on spotting this in yourself and developing some really healthy habits around one, recognizing it, and then two, sort of setting up systems to protect yourself from failed delegation is important. So, like, we like to advise clients, start with the small stuff. Like, what are some baby steps that you can take? Okay, schedule my flight, book my hair appointment. Like, what are some really simple things that you can do to build trust? And then really start to understand what the person you're delegating to needs to know to actually execute at the level you're looking for. And that takes, a commitment of your time. You have to kind of flesh out, these are the things that have to be true when you turn this back to me. And that takes, one, your own sort of knowledge around what your expectations are, because sometimes we expect things and we can't even verbalize them. And then what are some like touch points that you can put in place if the delegation starts to go off track? So if you find yourself, something's due on Friday and you're hearing about it the night before, that's going to trigger you in a big way. So can you have a meeting, just a sync type meeting, a couple days before something is due, so that you can build some buffer in for yourself so you don't feel the need to overindulge in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, because I do recognize that, that I remember when I first started, delegating to other people, I would sort of throw it out there without a lot of explanation, but my expectation was really big.
Right.
And then realizing I can't expect them to know what I'm thinking, like, why are they not getting this done? But realizing I wasn't giving them all of the information. I knew it, so I just assumed they would know it too, right?
Right. And then the delegation fails, and then you're like,
Yeah.
delegation doesn't work for me. And it's just this cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, so that's the interventionist, the classic micromanager. The third one is an isolationist. And that's the type that is always like, I'm just going to do it myself. And I think, again, we all do these things. We all have these behaviors. I've been delegating forever and I still do these things. So it's, the other thing that happens when you're an isolationist is that you don't even have opportunity to have conversation with the people you're delegating to, because you're too busy doing all the work yourself. So when you try to let things go, you're booked on 12 calls that day. So again, it's just an awareness and like an intentionality around, if you're going to delegate, that there's a priority happening where you're, syncing with that person and communicating with them.
So this would be more of like the person who maybe thinks it's just easier if I just do it myself.
And sometimes it is. And I'll be the first to tell you that, like, my team is like, well, why don't you give that to me? I said, well, I was just already on that webpage. Why wouldn't I just finish that myself? So, but I think the prompting, a team that's going to prompt you to think about why you're doing what you're doing is really important for you being able to trust and let go. Like, you're creating some accountability there with others saying, why did you do that? Why didn't you give that to me instead?
Okay. I'm going to have to look into that one more for myself, because I am guilty of that one. I'm thinking just recently.
Say it again.
I said I'm guilty of that one just recently. I was away on a trip. And so there was a lot of things that I was like, I have time. And then I just did it. But I realized after I got back that I caused more issues if I would have just left it, because then they were like, wait, what? You did that? No, I was doing this. Like, I was like, sorry, this is what happens when I get, quote unquote bored. Start going, well, I'll just do that for them.
Yeah, shiny object. I got you. Yeah. So yeah, that's the isolationist. They just, create a cocoon around themselves, and then they have no capacity to have any conversations with anyone about the task at hand.
Okay. All right.
Now, the fourth one is the one that I am most guilty of, and it's called the Time Optimist. And you can probably guess from the title what that means, but we can tend to be really unrealistic around what we can get done with the time and resources that we have. And what happens, and I'll speak to this point on the next bottleneck type, is that our teams live in execution and we live in ideation. And so what happens is, unless we've worked with our team to say, hey, I'm going to throw ideas at you, it doesn't mean anything other than I just need to share them. They're going to hear what you're talking about, and they're already going to be thinking about how they're going to execute on that thing. And that can start to get really overwhelming because they're already, dealing with 20 other things that you've already ideated onto them that they're now focused on. So understanding that dynamic exists, we could just move right into dreamer, because that's really what the dreamer, the fifth type, is the dreamer. They love ideas, and it really creates stress on our teams because they just want to execute on every single thing we're talking about. And a lot of the times we haven't even fully baked those thoughts into our own, what success looks like it's a great idea. I mean, I'm guilty of this all the time as well. So just seeing these behaviors, understanding them as bottleneck behaviors and why they're happening, and then trying to deploy some strategies around them.
And I think that's key, because I think, even for myself, there's, a lot, even as you were describing them, that I was like, yeah, I've been there. Yeah, I've done that. The dreamer one, for me is a big one, because I do realize that I, very much have a tendency of doing that. I'll have ideas that pop into my head, and my poor assistant has now learned, because she's been with me for a long time, has now learned it's just me balking, and I'll come to her and go, let's actually look at this more. But like, I'll come and throw like 18 things at her. And I remember before it was like a deer in headlights of her trying to figure out, like, it's impossible for me to get this, this all done. Whereas I felt refreshed because I was like, oh, they're all out of my head. I don't have
off
to
my
think.
head.
Yeah. Like, I feel great. Oh, that was like, really, really stress relieving. And meanwhile, she's like, there's not enough hours in the day. So I think that, that with the delegation, what I hear you're saying, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the communication piece is also is a really huge one in delegation.
100%, because that we have a delegation system that I created that is just a wheel of like how you can think through what to get off your plate and systematically do it. And one of those key steps is handoff. And so being really clear on, what does success look like if I'm going to ask you to do this thing? Now, book my flight, these kind of like task level tactical delegations, obviously we don't need to go as deep on, but on these larger picture things, for your assistant, when you start to do that, like I would recommend using a parking lot list, right? Where you're just like, I'm going to share this. Let's just put it on the parking lot and we'll talk about it later. And then, excuse me, that gives you time to sit with the idea yourself and determine whether or not it's really important and at what level of priority it's going to happen at.
Yeah. And yeah, I should do something more formal of that. We do. She just kind of keeps a list. And then, at the end of the month, we kind of meet, and then she'll say, you've mentioned, like, here's the things you've mentioned more than once. So she also helps to, filter out those ideas that I threw out, but have not thrown out again. She just kind of deletes them for me. I think she knows me well enough that if you mention it, I'll be like, let's look into that more.
Regulates you.
Yeah, exactly. But that, I mean, it was a long process to get to that type of relationship. And I think that's where, I feel in the past for myself personally, I went wrong because I would delegate, they wouldn't understand. And then I would go, well, this, like you had said before, well, this just doesn't work. Like having an assistant, a virtual assistant just isn't going to work for me, right? Because they just, I need somebody here. I need somebody in person. I need somebody who can understand it. But not realizing that it was me. It was not them, or a lot of it was me.
Brave of you to say. I think my sort of key message is having clarity on what you actually want to spend your time on. What is your biggest contribution? If you can be clear on that, that is the most important piece, because then we can systematically start to find things to pull off your plate that are not that. And being able to articulate that to your assistant helps her really prioritize your time if she's helping you with your calendar. Your priorities for the quarter, for the month, helping you with time blocking to actually get those things done, is sort of how like the execution piece to this conversation happens.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit, because I think this is going to tie in a little bit about your book. So you have an ebook, and then you also have this book that's coming out next year. So let's first talk about the ebook, because I think that'll be really beneficial. So tell us what it's all about, what people can expect out of it.
Yeah, so the ebook is free. I'm working to get it onto Audible as a audiobook, but it's a workbook, and it's all of our delegation content. It's called the Elevation Freedom Guide, and we cover the bottlenecks. We actually have a bottleneck diagnostic that you can take to score yourself in that regard. But we talk about just the foundational truths of delegation. So to me, delegation is if you picture a circle with 3 pieces in it, it's about the discipline. So a lot of this work with the bottlenecks, understanding what your impact should be. And then we talk about the art. So the art has to do with the what of delegation. So what is actually coming off your plate? And then we talk about the science of delegation, and that is the handoff from your plate to your assistant's plate, and what are some best practices for that. But it's a lot of introspective workbook style activities tied towards delegation in general. And then at the end, we have a 30 and 90 day map of how to actually delegate well. It's like a template that you can download if you want to actually start to put a delegation program in place. And then at the very end, we have habit trackers, which allow you to track, at least one habit you're trying to start with delegation. So that's the ebook.
Okay. Love templates, big template girl. So that always makes me happy when I'm like, ooh, love templates.
Yeah. And it's all mapped out, like how we would work with clients, month 1, month 2, creating a system that actually works with your employee.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, if you can give some stuff away about the Culture of Delegation book that is coming out next year.
Yeah. And one thing to add on to the ebook, we turned it into a course. So if you're someone that likes live learning, we built a small cohort type class that we run usually once a month, 6 sessions over 90 days. And we do a deep dive into the content in the ebook. We do small group sharing. There's usually like 5 to 8 people in those rooms. So the conversations are really meaningful. So if you want to go deeper with delegation, that's another way to think about it. So that's the ebook and the e-course. The book, A Culture of Delegation, is what I just turned in, and working with the editors at this point to get it ready for next year. But that book is broken into triads, and the first section of it really has to do with this mindset work, like understanding at a really deep level why we're struggling with this, especially for entrepreneurs. That's who I write for. That's who I work with. And then the second section is all about the tactical side of delegation. So the discipline, art, and science pieces, and we sort of do a deeper dive into those. And then the last part is the execution. And it's about how you take what you've learned with delegation and start to cascade that through your whole company. Because if you think about it, if your team is doing work they love, that energizes them, it's tying to their own personal mission, everyone's doing work they love, it's a retention strategy. So being able to deploy a delegation system to your team and give them the autonomy and the permission to delegate will help retain your employees too. So we talk that last third of the book about how to actually execute some of this stuff with other people.
Yeah. And I love that last piece, because I think that's an important one, because people learn all of the things but then they're like, now I don't know what to do with all this information.
Well, and I think I don't hear anyone talking about using delegation as a retention strategy, or using, the value that can come out of a team that's really elevated in terms of the contribution and impact that the company can have. And in that last part, and I can put this on the landing page for our conversation, we have a scorecard, and it's called an Elevation Success Scorecard. And it's the 5 habits and mindsets that must be present for us to be really elevated leaders. And you can score yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 and then get a top level score. You could have your team members score you and see where they think you're falling. And then you can track progress over time. So you could take it today and then work on this and then take it again in 90 days. But it allows you to really dial into like, okay, I'm really struggling with this mindset, as opposed to like, I can't delegate, I stink at it. It's like really tactical way to think about it.
And I love that you said that, because I think with a lot of entrepreneurs right now, and especially a lot of people heading into the virtual world and, doing collaboration and, just working with outside forces, that they're not thinking of that. That they've kind of gotten away of that and not realizing how important that retention piece is. Because when you build that team that kind of goes with you, the momentum can be so much greater, for your own success and for the business's success, if you have that same team, because training takes a lot of time. For me anyway, I'm thinking, gosh, to get somebody used to me takes a while.
Yeah, and I have a template in there that you can give to your team. And we just kind of talk about, what are you spending your time on now? How does that make you feel? If you could spend your time doing work that you love, what would those things be? How would you feel if you were spending your time? So we're tying some emotion into the activity also. And then, you could give that type of assessment or evaluation to your team at whatever frequency and just continually elevate their time. But one sort of caution point on going gangbusters on that strategy, because I know some of you entrepreneurs will quick start and be like, yeah, I'm doing that. And like, okay, now everybody's like losing their mind because you've just created chaos. So hold on. Just some awareness. Your team is not used to that type of work environment, most likely. It can be really scary for them. They will feel like how we're talking earlier, like they might feel like, well, if I'm not doing this work, then what's my purpose, right? So you want to make sure that there's clarity on what they're doing instead. Again, tied to the top foundational piece we were talking about. So understand there might be fear there. There might be like a lot of death grip happening, even though that might be conflicting with what you think might happen. Just be prepared for those kind of scenarios and don't just like gangbust your way into this type of conversation.
So if people are sitting there and they're going, you've created a great page. So I do want to talk about all of the resources that they'll be able to find on the page that you had created for us. But if they're sitting there going, okay, I know I want to do this, I know I need to do this, but I'm worried I'm going to scare the crap out of my team. How would they get in contact with you to see, can you help me with this so that I don't send them all running?
Yeah, well, I am not prepared to help you with that other than the book at this point.
Right.
So I'm not doing like consultation, but we do cover that in the book. And I think, the number one thing to do is do it first yourself. All right. And like get comfortable with it. And then have your leadership team do it. Then you can start to cascade it. Like this is not a, quick fix HR, try this thing. This is like a culture change in a really big and meaningful way. So, take your time with it, get comfortable first yourself.
So let's talk a little bit about the resources that they'll find on the page.
Sure. So on the landing page, we've got our ebook link, which is free. We've got a link to the e-course. We call that the Elevation Quarter. And then we have a link to schedule a discovery call. So if you're someone that's interested in getting delegation support, you want someone to help you figure out what to delegate, how to delegate, and put a system and team around that to help you get those things off your plate. That's what we do. And that's where you could schedule a discovery call.
Perfect. Well, I think there's definitely a lot for people to sort of dig into and, questions to even start asking themselves of, is this an area that, could help me, because ideally at the end of the day, we don't want to be working 24 hours a day. That's not why well, I'm hoping that's not why most people got into business in the first place for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you being clear on what you're here to contribute. If you leave with one thing to work on, that would be my number one suggestion. Because once you have a lot of clarity on that, all of the delegation can start to flow.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's just definitely a lot of stuff to think about and to review. And I think that people are definitely going to get a lot out of this. So I so appreciate your time.
Yes, my delegation content is not your normal content, so it's definitely deeper conversations. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much to Emily for coming on the show and just getting us thinking a little bit more about how to delegate. So I encourage you all to head to our website at foxtalksbusiness.ca. Click on blogs on the left-hand side of the page. You are going to see this episode with a special link just for you, Foxy listeners. So on this special page that Emily made for us, you're going to be able to find a little bit more information about her. You're also going to find the link for her e-workbook, for her e-learning course, and for a discovery call. She also added in a bunch of additional resources like her Elevation Success Scorecard, some sample tasks, her freedom guide, a bottleneck diagnosis, and even more. You're also going to find a special 10% off if you are interested in going deeper with delegation as part of a really small facilitated group, which she talked about, called the Elevation Quarter. So you're going to want to head there and you will find the code to get 10% off learning how to upgrade your delegation. So no matter what you're doing today, whether you're taking on everything by yourself or whether you are finally learning to delegate, make sure you take time to have fun. Because as I always say, if you're not having fun, why are you doing it?